Day 5 and welcome to today's history lesson. So this is your last history lesson before we return back to school next week. So we've briefly touched upon Viking runes, but we've not done a lot of information about it or researched into it much. And we're going to do an art-based activity when we come back next week. So I want to go back and recap onto the Viking runes and give you an activity to familiarise yourself with the alphabet, ready for our activity that we're going to do next week. So, like wrestling, swimming, fighting, writing is always considered to be a special skill among the Vikings. Obviously, we know with regards to education, only a few people were privy to education because they were either at home learning how to sew, to cook, and to make things at home, or they were always out exploring. So here you can see we've got some shapes, okay? Obviously, we know that these are the Viking runes. What do you notice about these shapes? Thinking about the lines, thinking about whether they look familiar, whether they don't look familiar, think about what it is that they've been written on as well. So what's the Viking in this picture doing, and what do you think is on the pieces of wood that he's looking at? So I'm assuming from the idea that he's got a sword here, he's got his helmet on here, obviously he's a Viking soldier. The fact that he looks like he's looking at something, I'm going to go on the basis that he's reading something. Now, the fact that it's on a piece of wood and it's not in a book suggests that obviously they didn't have books in those days. And we know from looking at things like our Mayan writing, when they used to make the folding concertina books that they found in all the different places, the codices, they had to use other materials. Obviously here, he's ended up looking at something that's made of the wood. So what letters in our alphabet use lines and not curves? So if you have a look at them, we've got A, B, D's got a straight line, E, F, H, I, K, L, M, N, T, V, W, X, Y, and Z. All of these other ones, like your C, your D, G, O, P, Q, S, they've all got curved letters in them. Okay, now we know the Viking letters were called runes, and they weren't written with pen and ink on paper like we do nowadays. Instead, they were carved into something, be it stone or be it wood, and it was carved with what's called a knife and a chisel. Okay, now a chisel almost looks like a giant nail, so it's got a flat head to it, and then it's got a point to the metal. And if you use a hammer and you bang onto the end of it, that point that's then on the end of either the wood or is attached to the stone then starts to chip away, okay? Now, it's a lot easier to be able to carve in stone and wood because they can be a softer surface, and that's the reason why runes were made using only straight lines. So why do you think there were no curved lines in the Viking letters? Well, I'm going to go on the basis that it's difficult to do it with curved lines. If you've got a chisel that's got a straight point on it, it's easier to do a straight line than it would be to then do a curvy line. It's actually more difficult to create curves, especially when you're using a hammer and a chisel. So the Vikings carved their straight line letters of their alphabet in stone, wood, or bone and metal. Now, because they can have quite a pliable surface and that you can etch things into them, it makes it quite easy. Now, these lines were first made on a stave, which is a series of lines that served as a guide. So you know when we've done like our English writing, for those that use plain paper, I've created the line guides that got the lines underneath. This is the same sort of principle, so they use this stave, and this allows them to be able to draw their rune letters, okay? Now, it was made using straight sticks, and you can trace any letter of the Viking alphabet on that stave. So it's almost like a guideline for them to be able to write in a series of lines using their alphabet. Now, we know about Odin, for those of you that know about your Viking gods and goddesses and anyone involved interested in the Avengers and the Marvel movies. The Vikings believed that Odin hung upside down on what was called the Tree of Knowledge for 9 days. And when he saw the runes, he used his sword to then carve them into the tree. So they came to him in a vision, and he then carved that vision out into the wood. Okay, now in return for gaining that wisdom and the magical powers from the runes, he gave up one of his eyes. Now, obviously, when we look at the Marvel movies, we see a very different story to that. But it was almost like a sacrifice, something they were giving, because obviously he was given godly-like powers. And because of that sacrifice, the Vikings then considered the runes to be sacred. Because someone's had to give up something for it, and they have a magical power or a godlike power, that's seen as a power that's higher up. You know, that's someone that you then worship. So they actually considered the runes as quite sacred. Now, here's a question for you. How do you know who owns a PE bag in lost property? Or a PE bag that's lying on the floor outside our Year 5 classroom, or is thrown on top of the lockers, or accidentally gets left on the playground, or a cardigan on the playground, or a shoe somewhere in the dinner hall? How do we know what belongs to who? Well, I'd like to think that you'd have everything named, wouldn't you? So runes weren't used just to write stories. Okay, they were used originally for everyday uses such as labeling household items and personal belongings. So if you, when you buy spices from the supermarket, they've got labels on them. You know what the spices are. In those days, anything they'd have in the house, they'd label. Same as personal belongings. When I was at school, my PE socks, my school uniform, my school bag, my school books, everything was labelled with my name on so that I knew what property was mine. But they were also used by merchants, so people who used to work and ship things across from abroad, to keep records of items that they'd then bought and sold. So keeping logbooks, a bit like we take a register and I tick you off on the days you're here and I cross you off on the days that you're not. Same for the merchants. It was a way of them keeping a log, so a record of what things had been sold and what things had been bought. Obviously nowadays we have computerized systems to be able to do that and barcodes and scanning systems, but that's where it started from, okay? So here is one of those kind of pegs, okay? And this peg here, okay, was used to identify property, and it reads Thorgrim's pile, okay? So it belonged to a Viking called Thorgrim, and anything that was attached to that wooden peg here belonged to him, okay? So you can see how they would have used a thin piece of wood and they've carved it on there. Rather than nowadays, you can buy stamps that you can iron on, you can stitch labels in, you can write things on a label. That's how they used to do it in the Viking times. Now, just have a look at these pictures here. What do you think these are, and what do you notice about the shapes on the spearheads? I just want you to pause the video and just have a close look at what these are and what you can see. So these are spearheads, okay? And Viking warriors would decorate their swords and their spears with runic symbols, okay? And they were obviously, they were different to the runic alphabet. So you can see here we've got some patterns. We've got a circular one here, we've got a square base one here, we've got an arrow one here that looks like a feather. We've got some boxes and some wiggly lines on this one and some zigzags. They were slightly different. They believed that the runes were magical, so it made their weapons stronger. Same as when we looked at the Viking shields. With their Viking shields, they would be personalised, wouldn't they? With their own animal that represented their family, with their own colours that were almost like a tribute to their family and their upbringing. Same thing goes for their spears. So they thought that they were magical, so they'd make their weapons stronger. And they believed that warriors who knew how to read and write could blunt enemies' weapons, break chains, cure illnesses, guard against witches, and protect in battle on over threatening seas. So believing that warriors could read and write effectively gave them magical superpowers in their opinion. So it was almost like a threat to the enemy. You see a spear that's got runes and writing on it, you think, well, hang on, they're very intelligent, they can read and write, let's be wary of them. Which obviously, I wouldn't necessarily say that they'd have magical powers, but it's that idea of instilling threat and fear into the opposition. Now, when someone dies, obviously we have graveyards and we have what's called a tombstone, okay, or a gravestone. And usually on that stone gives you the name of the person, a little phrase that's written by the family on it about, being in memory or a loving father, husband, sister, daughter. And it would tell you from the date they were born to the date that they died. And that would give you the information about who that tombstone belonged to. And Vikings made what was called rune stones. Okay, now these were often decorated with black, red, blue, and white paint. And obviously, we know from the Viking times they didn't have access to the type of paints that we have nowadays, but they would be made from certain household materials, be it from berries, because you get the pigment and the dye, any garden plants. I know we looked at a couple of garden plants because the same thing happened with the Mayans when they used to dye their silks, and clay-like earth. And clay-like earth is almost like that browny grey kind of texture. Now, the stones often depicted, so showed, snakes, horses, and ships, along with an inscription. So that inscription is that bit of writing that's written on them about that person. And it gave them the information about the families, the death, and the name that they were given. So that was their version of a tombstone. Okay, and you can see here how brightly decorated they are. Now this one looks like one that might have been in the process of being finished, or there is an old decoration that's gone behind this and it's been repainted. But again, they'd use a hammer and their chisel and they would etch this in. Obviously, they later began to develop the skill of being able to carve it, okay, using the curved edges. But that is primarily what their tombstones used to look like, and they were called rune stones. Now, have any of you ever seen these before? They sometimes pop up in movies, sometimes. So these are Viking runes. So each of the letters is written or is inscribed on, be it a stone or a wooden pellet. And they were about the size of your thumb. Okay, they were very, very small. People used to be able to carry them in little bags, and like witches would use them for spells and all sorts. Now, the stones were placed in bags and then removed one by one by Viking fortune tellers and magicians. So, if any of you have ever seen Stardust, it's a movie that came out a few years ago about a star that fell from the sky and it turned into a beautiful young lady. And there were some witches that were trying to stay young and needed to eat the hearts of a young, beautiful woman that's a star. And they used to use these runes and used to be able to tell their fortunes. Okay, so the stones are then used to predict a future. It could be to heal the sick, it could be to banish evil. So it might be almost to cast a nasty spell on them. It might be to do for good, it might be to bless people, bless places, or bless things. So usually it was involved with witchcraft and fortune tellers and magicians, but that was primarily what they were used for when they were made into teeny tiny little rune stones. So here is the Viking alphabet, okay? So we've got 24 characters in the runic alphabet and they are arranged in alphabetical order. And can you see any letters that are similar to ours? Now we've looked at this on one of our previous lessons and we could say that some of them, like the R was the same, the B looked the same, the F wasn't too far off. And then we said there were some odd ones where like the M looks like a Y, and then the Y over here was like the upside down version of a Y, and then we were confused as to why the P looked like a K. Some of them were a little bit off. So what I want you to do now, might be easy for you to go back and pause it on this screen rather than this screen because it just looks a tad blurry on here. I want you to have a go at practicing at writing your name in the runes letters, and then I'm going to set you off on activity. So just pause the video, see if you can write your name using the rune letters. Okay, now some of you might struggle with that a little bit if you had a missing letter, but we will expand on that next week as to how they used to go about spelling their words in comparison to our alphabet and our letters. So what you're going to do is you're going to write a message to your Viking friend telling them about the battle between Beowulf and Grendel. Now, it doesn't have to be long. It can quite literally be 2 or 3 short lines. So we had a party last night and a Beowulf came over and there was some horrific screaming. Just want you to write a very short message to a friend. And then what we're going to do is once you've had that practice of being able to use the alphabet, when we come back next week, we're going to have a go at designing our own little runes, be it a name tag or being a label for something, or it could be a little message for someone out of the clay. But this is just an activity for you to have a go at practicing what it is that you're going to write. What I would suggest is that you do it in English first. If you have missing letters that don't appear in our alphabet and it doesn't appear in theirs, then you miss out those words. Okay, you miss out those letters. But I just want you to have a go at practicing using that alphabet. If that's too difficult, have an experiment about creating different words that you can using the Viking alphabet. All I want you to do is have a practice. I'm not expecting it to be perfect, but it's just to familiarise yourself with the alphabet. Okay. So give it a go and see how you get on. And I look forward to making some of these with our clay and our runes next week. Good luck.